One of the biggest mistakes an avoidant person makes is believing that the people who truly love them will never leave. That assumption quietly shapes the entire relationship dynamic. In the beginning, they may appear independent, calm, even emotionally controlled. But underneath that surface is often a deep discomfort with vulnerability. They want connection, but they also fear the emotional responsibility that comes with genuine intimacy. So instead of leaning into love, they create distance from it. And this is where the confusion begins for the other person. You try harder. You communicate more. You become more patient, more understanding, more forgiving. Every time they pull away, you move closer emotionally because you believe consistency and love will eventually make them feel safe. But what you don't realize is that the avoidant slowly becomes accustomed to your presence. Your loyalty stops feeling valuable to them because it feels guaranteed. Human beings naturally respect what they fear losing, and the avoidant often believes they are never truly at risk of losing you. So they delay difficult conversations. They avoid emotional accountability. They disappear during moments of intimacy. They convince themselves that you will always understand, always wait, always return. Psychologically, this comes from emotional conditioning. Many avoidants learned early in life that closeness leads to discomfort, pressure, or disappointment. So when someone genuinely loves them, instead of fully embracing it, they unconsciously test its limits. They create distance to regain control. And each time you stay, despite the inconsistency, the subconscious message becomes stronger. No matter how I behave, this person won't leave. But eventually something changes. Not because you stop loving them, but because you finally become exhausted from carrying the emotional weight of the relationship alone. There comes a moment when the pain of staying becomes greater than the pain of walking away. And when that moment arrives, you stop chasing. You stop over-explaining. You stop fighting for basic emotional reciprocity. To the avoidant, this shift feels shocking because they were prepared for your tears. They were prepared for your emotional reactions. They were prepared for another attempt to reconnect. What they were not prepared for was your silence. Calm detachment terrifies an avoidant far more than emotional intensity because silence removes their sense of control. For the first time, they can no longer predict your emotional availability. And this is the irony of avoidant psychology. They often do not emotionally process the relationship while they are inside it. They process it after the connection is gone. Loss creates the emotional confrontation they spent months or years avoiding. Suddenly, the certainty they once relied on disappears. The person they assumed would always be there is no longer emotionally reachable. That realization hits deeply because human beings rarely appreciate permanence. We appreciate what feels fragile, what can be lost, what is no longer guaranteed. And by the time the avoidant finally understands your value, they are forced to face the one thing they spent their whole life trying to escape: the consequences of emotional distance. Sometimes the greatest wake-up call is realizing the person you took for granted finally learned how to live without you. What truly unsettles an avoidant person is not conflict. It is not distance. And surprisingly, it is not even the breakup itself. What affects them most is witnessing the person they emotionally neglected begin to heal without them. That is the moment the emotional reality finally becomes unavoidable. You have to understand how avoidance works psychologically. Avoidants are highly skilled at suppressing emotional discomfort in real time. Instead of confronting painful feelings directly, they distract themselves from them. They stay busy. They focus on work, routines, independence, or superficial connections. They convince themselves they are fine because they mistake emotional numbness for emotional strength. But suppression is never resolution. The emotions do not disappear. They simply wait. And while the avoidant is busy escaping emotional confrontation, the other person, the one who truly loved, begins the painful process of healing. At first, healing looks messy. There is grief, confusion, loneliness, and emotional withdrawal. But eventually, something powerful starts happening. The person who was abandoned emotionally begins reconnecting with themselves. Their energy slowly returns. Their confidence rebuilds. Their emotional dependence fades. And this transformation becomes deeply triggering for the avoidant. Because as long as you were still emotionally attached, they unconsciously felt secure. Even if they created distance, a part of them believed they still occupied emotional space in your life. Your pain reassured them of their importance. Your waiting reassured them of their significance. But healing changes the entire psychological dynamic. The moment you stop centering your life around their inconsistency, the avoidant begins feeling something they have spent years trying to outrun: loss. Not imagined loss, real loss. And real loss activates fear in a way emotional closeness never could. This is why many avoidants suddenly reappear once you begin moving forward. It is not always manipulation in the calculated sense people imagine. Often it is panic. Your healing removes the emotional safety net they took for granted. They start realizing that your attention, patience, and emotional loyalty were never permanent guarantees. They were choices. And now those choices are disappearing. Philosophically, this reveals something profound about human nature. People often fail to understand value while access is unlimited. Certainty creates complacency. But once access becomes uncertain, perception changes immediately. The avoidant begins replaying memories they once minimized. Conversations they ignored suddenly become meaningful. Your emotional support becomes impossible to replace. And because avoidants tend to emotionally process relationships later than others, your growth becomes the mirror they can no longer avoid looking into. Your healing forces them to confront themselves. Not the version of themselves they present to the world, but the emotionally disconnected patterns underneath. They begin recognizing how often they withheld affection, avoided vulnerability, or pushed away the very person who tried to love them consistently. And that awareness creates internal conflict because it challenges the identity they built around emotional self-protection. The painful truth is that your healing exposes what their avoidance cost them. Because when someone truly moves on emotionally, they stop trying to be understood by the person who hurt them. They stop chasing closure. They stop waiting for validation. They become emotionally free. And nothing frightens an avoidant more than realizing the person they thought would always stay has finally found peace without them. Sometimes your greatest power is not making someone love you. It is showing them you no longer need them to survive. One of the most painful realities in relationships with avoidant people is that they often mistake patience for weakness. When someone continues showing up with understanding, empathy, and emotional consistency, the avoidant can unconsciously begin to see that love as something ordinary instead of something rare. And this happens because human psychology has a dangerous tendency. We become blind to the value of what remains constantly available to us. Think about it. You stayed during the confusion. You stayed during the emotional distance. You stayed when communication became inconsistent, when affection became unpredictable, when effort became one-sided. And you stayed because you believed love meant understanding someone's wounds, not punishing them for them. You believed your patience would eventually create safety. But the avoidant interpreted that patience differently. Instead of recognizing emotional strength, they often saw emotional tolerance. Instead of appreciating your loyalty, they became accustomed to it. This is not always intentional cruelty. In many cases, it is unconscious conditioning. Avoidants are often emotionally disconnected from the impact they have on others because they learned early in life to minimize emotional needs, both their own and everyone else's. So when someone continuously forgives them, reassures them, and adapts to their emotional inconsistency, they stop seeing the emotional cost attached to that effort. They assume your love is simply part of the environment. Permanent, predictable, unshakable. And the human mind rarely protects what it believes cannot be lost. This is why emotionally mature people often suffer deeply in avoidant relationships. They keep extending understanding while slowly abandoning themselves in the process. They become emotionally over-responsible. They carry the communication. They repair every conflict. They justify behavior that would normally be unacceptable because they are focused on preserving connection rather than evaluating reciprocity. But eventually, emotional exhaustion changes perspective. There comes a moment when the patient person begins realizing something important. Love without mutual emotional effort becomes self-abandonment. And once that realization happens, their energy shifts completely. They stop proving their worth to someone committed to emotional distance. They stop over-functioning in a relationship built on imbalance. And suddenly the avoidant notices the difference. Because what they once perceived as weakness was actually emotional discipline. What they called always being there was a level of loyalty they may never encounter again. The emotional safety you provided was not common. It was rare. But familiarity prevented them from seeing it clearly. Psychologically, people often recognize value through absence rather than presence. While something exists consistently in front of them, they normalize it. But once it disappears, the emotional nervous system reacts immediately. The avoidant begins comparing future interactions to the emotional steadiness you once gave them. They start noticing how difficult it is to find someone patient enough to understand their fears without constantly attacking them for it. And this realization creates regret because deep down, they understand they were given something authentic while they still lack the emotional awareness to fully receive it. The tragedy is not simply that they lost you. The tragedy is that they misunderstood you while they had you. They confused calm love with weakness because they had never learned the difference between emotional control and emotional indifference. But life eventually teaches everyone the same lesson. The people who love you consistently are not weak people. They are rare people. And nothing becomes more valuable than a love you can no longer return to. Avoidant people often spend years believing that emotional independence is strength. They convince themselves that needing no one protects them from pain. So whenever relationships become too intimate, too vulnerable, too emotionally demanding, they instinctively create distance. They retreat into work, distractions, routines, temporary connections, or isolation. And on the surface, it can appear as though they are completely unaffected. But emotional avoidance is not freedom. It is emotional postponement. The feelings do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They accumulate beneath the surface, waiting for silence, waiting for loneliness, waiting for the moment distractions no longer work. And this is exactly why many avoidants do not fully experience the emotional consequences of a relationship until after the connection has ended. While you were there, your presence softened the emptiness they carried internally. Even if they struggled to express love consistently, a part of them relied on your emotional stability. Your messages, your patience, your understanding, your availability, these things created emotional grounding whether they admitted it or not. But once you move on, that emotional structure disappears. And suddenly, they are left alone with themselves. This is where the real confrontation begins. At first, avoidants often attempt to replace connection quickly, not necessarily because they have healed, but because they are uncomfortable sitting with emotional discomfort. They search for distractions instead of introspection. But the problem is that emotional depth cannot be replaced by emotional convenience. Surface-level interactions may provide temporary stimulation, but they rarely create genuine emotional fulfillment. So eventually comparisons begin happening unconsciously. The avoidant starts remembering how safe your presence felt. They remember the conversations they once took for granted. They remember the emotional acceptance they rarely found elsewhere. And for the first time, they begin noticing the difference between attention and connection. This realization can feel deeply unsettling because it forces them to confront a painful truth. The emotional emptiness they kept running from was never caused by other people. It was caused by their inability to remain emotionally open long enough to sustain intimacy. Philosophically, this reflects one of the deepest human struggles. Many people spend their lives trying to avoid pain only to discover that avoidance itself becomes the source of suffering. The avoidant believed distance would protect them. But emotional walls do not only block pain, they also block closeness, trust, love, and meaning. And eventually, isolation stops feeling peaceful. It starts feeling empty. This is why losing someone emotionally mature affects avoidance so profoundly over time. You represented something they could not easily recreate. Emotional safety without manipulation, consistency without control, love without performance. Once that disappears, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The distractions become quieter. The nights become longer, and the emotions they postponed begin demanding attention. For perhaps the first time in their life, they are forced to sit with the consequences of their own emotional patterns instead of escaping them. And that internal confrontation can be incredibly painful because it removes every external excuse. There is no one left to blame, no conflict left to avoid, no distraction strong enough to silence the truth. They realized they were not protecting themselves from love. They were protecting themselves from vulnerability while losing the very connection they secretly needed most. And sometimes the greatest loneliness is not being abandoned by others. It is realizing you abandoned genuine love before you understood its value. There is a moment in every emotionally imbalanced relationship when words stop having power. You explain your feelings repeatedly. You try to communicate your needs with patience, clarity, and compassion. You attempt to make the other person understand how their distance, inconsistency, or emotional unavailability is affecting the connection. And for a long time, you believe that if you just say it the right way, eventually something will change. But with avoidant psychology, understanding is rarely created through explanation alone. It is often created through absence. That is the painful paradox. Because while you were present, while you were fighting for the relationship, forgiving the mixed signals, tolerating the emotional distance, the avoidant still had access to your energy. They could delay emotional growth because your presence softened the consequences of their behavior. Even if conflict existed, they subconsciously knew the connection was still available. And human beings rarely confront the full value of something while uninterrupted access still exists. This is why your absence becomes their greatest lesson. Not because you intended to teach them a lesson, manipulate them, or make them suffer. Genuine emotional detachment is not revenge. It is survival. There comes a point where constantly proving your value to someone emotionally unavailable begins damaging your self-respect. You realize you cannot force emotional maturity out of another person. You cannot heal someone into loving you correctly. And most importantly, you cannot build intimacy with someone who keeps treating vulnerability like danger. So eventually you stop trying, and that silence changes everything. When you stop over-explaining yourself, the avoidant loses the emotional noise they relied on to avoid self-reflection. When you stop chasing them, they lose the reassurance that someone will always repair the emotional distance they create. When you emotionally detach, they are finally left alone with the consequences of their own behavior. This is the moment awareness begins, because now there is space for reality to enter. The avoidant starts replaying memories differently. Conversations they once dismissed suddenly carry emotional weight. Moments where you asked for reassurance, affection, or honesty no longer seem dramatic. They begin seeing those moments through a new psychological lens, not as pressure, but as attempts at connection. And this shift can be deeply painful because hindsight removes emotional defensiveness. While the relationship existed, they could rationalize their behavior. They could tell themselves they needed space, independence, or less emotional intensity. But once the relationship is gone, they are forced to confront a more uncomfortable truth. Much of the distance they created was rooted in fear, not freedom. Fear of vulnerability, fear of dependence, fear of being fully seen emotionally. And the tragedy is that they often realize this only after the emotionally available person has already let go. Philosophically, this speaks to a larger truth about human nature. People do not always grow through instruction. Many grow through loss. Pain has a way of revealing realities the ego spent years avoiding. When someone truly important leaves your life emotionally, it removes the illusion that time is unlimited. Suddenly, all the conversations you postponed, all the affection you withheld, all the emotional risks you refused to take become permanent missed opportunities. And missed opportunities carry a unique kind of pain because they cannot be rewritten. This is why absence can transform perception more powerfully than presence ever could. Your absence forces the avoidant to experience life without the emotional safety they once overlooked. They begin noticing how rare genuine patience is, how rare emotional consistency is, how rare it is to find someone willing to understand wounds they themselves never fully understood. And for perhaps the first time, they recognize the emotional labor you carried quietly for so long. They realize you were not asking for too much. You were asking for reciprocity. You were asking for emotional presence. You were asking for the kind of connection healthy relationships are built upon. But by the time this awareness fully develops, you are no longer emotionally standing in the same place. That is what makes the regret so profound. The avoidant expects that realization alone should reopen the connection. But healing changes people. Once someone spends enough time rebuilding themselves, they stop romanticizing emotional inconsistency. They stop confusing potential with reality. They stop accepting partial love while sacrificing their emotional stability. And this becomes the avoidant's greatest lesson. Sometimes the person who loved you the deepest eventually learns how to love themselves more. Not out of bitterness, not out of revenge, but out of wisdom. Because real healing teaches people that love should not require abandoning themselves to keep someone else comfortable. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can say is nothing at all. Because silence often reveals what words never could. Perhaps the deepest regret an avoidant experiences is not simply losing someone they loved. It is watching that person become stronger, happier, and emotionally fulfilled without them. Because at the beginning, the avoidant often believes that your emotional attachment to them is permanent. They assume your love will continue regardless of how inconsistent, distant, or emotionally unavailable they become. And for a while, that assumption appears true. You stay. You fight for the connection. You continue believing there is still something worth saving beneath the emotional walls they keep building. But people change when pain teaches them what self-respect requires. Eventually, you stop centering your life around someone else's inability to love you consistently. You begin rebuilding your confidence. You reconnect with your purpose, your peace, your emotional stability, and little by little, the version of you that once begged for emotional clarity disappears. This transformation affects the avoidant more deeply than most people realize, because avoidants are often emotionally comfortable when they feel psychologically in control of the distance. As long as they believe they can return whenever they choose, the emotional consequences remain abstract. But when they see you genuinely evolving without them, smiling again, growing again, emotionally detached from the cycle they created, the illusion of control collapses. And that collapse creates regret. Not surface level regret, existential regret. Because now they are forced to confront a reality they never prepared for. You did not break permanently after losing them. You rebuilt yourself despite them. Psychologically, this is incredibly confronting for an avoidant because your healing contradicts the emotional narrative they unconsciously relied upon. Part of them believed your connection would remain emotionally available forever. But your growth proves something different. It proves that people eventually adapt to pain. Human beings recover. Hearts heal. Emotional dependency fades. And once that happens, the avoidant realizes they are no longer looking at the same person they once neglected emotionally. They are looking at someone who has regained their emotional independence. Someone who no longer needs reassurance from the very person who once withheld it. Someone who discovered peace outside the relationship. And peace is powerful because it changes what a person is willing to tolerate. This is why avoidants often become emotionally reactive after the other person fully moves on. It is not always because they suddenly discovered love overnight. Often it is because they are witnessing the irreversible consequences of emotional neglect. They are watching someone they underestimated become emotionally unavailable to them. And human beings are deeply affected by irreversible loss. Philosophically, this reveals something important about transformation. True growth does not happen when someone keeps waiting to be chosen. It happens when they choose themselves. The moment you stop measuring your worth through another person's emotional inconsistency, your entire identity begins changing. You stop operating from fear of abandonment and start operating from self-respect. That energy is impossible to ignore. The avoidant notices your emotional calmness. They notice your reduced need for validation. They notice that you no longer react the same way to their inconsistency. And for perhaps the first time, they fully understand what they lost. Not just a relationship, but access to someone who genuinely loved them despite their emotional barriers. But timing matters in life. And awareness delayed too long often becomes regret instead of reconciliation. Because once someone heals deeply enough, they stop seeing love as sacrifice alone. They begin understanding that healthy love requires mutual effort, emotional accountability, vulnerability, and consistency. They stop trying to rescue emotionally unavailable people at the cost of their own peace. And that is the painful irony for the avoidant. The version of you they finally learned to value is no longer the version willing to accept emotional half measures. By the time they fully recognize your worth, you have already recognized your own. And there is no loss more painful than realizing you pushed away the very person who once would have done anything to stay. At the end of all this, the real lesson is not simply about avoidant psychology. It is about human nature. People often fail to recognize the value of love while they still have uninterrupted access to it. They assume loyalty will remain forever. They assume patience has no limits. They assume the person constantly fighting for the relationship will never become tired of carrying the emotional weight alone. But every human being reaches a moment where survival becomes more important than attachment. And that is when everything changes. The avoidant spends so much time protecting themselves from vulnerability that they fail to realize something profound. Love is not the enemy. Emotional honesty is not weakness. Dependence is not failure when it exists in healthy balance. The very intimacy they feared was often the one thing capable of healing the loneliness they carried internally for years. But fear has consequences. When someone continuously avoids emotional accountability, avoids communication, and avoids vulnerability, they eventually create the very outcome they were trying to prevent: abandonment. Not because the other person stopped loving them, but because the other person finally started loving themselves enough to stop accepting emotional inconsistency. And that is the deepest shift in this entire story. The person who once waited for reassurance learns how to reassure themselves. The person who once begged for clarity learns how to walk away from confusion. The person who once feared losing the relationship eventually realizes they were losing themselves trying to save it. That transformation is powerful. Because once someone discovers peace after emotional chaos, they rarely volunteer to return to suffering. Healing changes your standards. It changes your emotional boundaries. It changes the way you define love itself. You stop chasing potential and start valuing reciprocity. You stop romanticizing emotional distance and start recognizing consistency as one of the purest forms of love. And for the avoidant, this realization often arrives too late. They finally understand your value when your energy is no longer available to them in the same way. They finally recognize your patience when your silence replaces it. They finally feel the emotional weight of losing you when you are no longer emotionally standing still waiting for them to change. But life works this way for many people. Sometimes growth comes through connection. Sometimes it comes through loss. And sometimes the people who changed your life the most are the people you failed to appreciate while they were still beside you. So if there is one truth to remember from all of this, it is this: love cannot survive where vulnerability is constantly avoided, but neither can the human spirit survive where self-respect is constantly sacrificed. Eventually, one person stops running from intimacy, and the other stops running after them.